Welcome to Explore, Explain. This is a long-form video and podcast series sharing conversations with data visualization designers and developers from around the world. Each episode explores the detailed hidden thinking behind a single project or a series of related works to explain the what, the why, and the how of the design process. There are some wonderful guests and some wonderful projects to learn about. So let's jump in to today's episode with your host, Andy Kirk.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Explore, Explain. My name's Andy Kirk, and in today's special opening episode of Series 4, I have Neil Richards. Neil, good to see you again. How are you doing?
Hi, Andy. Yeah, I'm doing okay, thanks. It's exciting to be on here for the first one of a new year.
Absolutely. Well, it's a pleasure to have you. And in this session, we're going to talk about a book project that you've worked on, not a data viz itself, but a book project, which is not an insignificant task. And this is a book called Questions in Data Viz, a design-driven process for data visualization, which came out, I think, November last year, technically. But
Right.
It's a great book, and thank you for writing it, Neil. But listen, just to give listeners and viewers a sense of a bit more of who you are and what you do, can you just give people a brief introduction for yourself?
Yes, of course. So my name's Neil Richards. In my day job, I'm a data analyst, I guess, in BI team. Although I've just recently moved into a lead data fluency role that I'm quite excited about. But much of what's in the book focuses on what I love to do with data visualization, mainly in personal creative projects. So that's probably what I'm sort of more well known for. I do a lot of my work in Tableau, and I've been lucky enough to be a Tableau visionary and a Tableau Zen master a few times. And yeah, that's it really. I consider myself a data visualization enthusiast and,
Right.
and a fan and a hobbyist and all these kind of things. So the
Yeah.
book is all about what I love doing.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting starting point in terms of how we label ourselves. What are we? Are we designers? Are we developers? Are we masters? Are we enthusiasts? Do we do it for a living? Is it just a side note? It's something that I often find it's quite difficult to sort of pocket ourselves into certain compartments in this. But I think what you touched on there as as an enthusiast and as something that has been, in terms of, duration, a relatively recent um, movement into data viz for yourself around, and correct me if I'm wrong, about 2015, 16, possibly. And I think as we come onto in the book, it's a really sort of charming sort of story that encapsulates your journey as much as data viz in and of itself. But I guess the first question with all this is, how did the book project come about? What triggered it? Did you go to somebody? Did somebody come to you? What's the backstory?
Yeah, I mean, it came about. It's a little bit of a cliche. I'd always thought, well, it might be nice to write a book, and if I ever did, what would it be on? And the cliche is it was a sort of a lockdown idea, and I joke about it, but it's true. I tried baking bread, and I wasn't very good. I finished with the jigsaws in the house. I thought, what other lockdown cliches are there? And it came about through an online conversation, really with I saw a guy on Twitter who was an editor, and he'd been an editor of the Data Sketches book by Nadine Bremer and Shirley Wu. And I said, if ever I wanted to write a data visualization book, what would I have to do? And much to my surprise, he replied, and he answered, he said, well, tell me about it, pitch it to me. We have a data visualization series, which I'm looking for more authors for. And I thought, wow, so I would be in the same series as Nadia and Shirley's book. Well, it's a huge jump, but why not? So I had this conversation and pitched the book. And one of his first things, which was both wonderful and daunting in equal measures, we said, well, obviously it'll have to go past our expert editorial team, Alberto and Tamara. And I thought, surely there can only be one Alberto and there can only be one Tamara. but I thought, well, I won't let that put me off, because obviously I know they're both great names, but also, you know, highly approachable and supportive people, and that turned out to be how it was. I pitched my book. The consensus was that, you know, there was a space for it, that it could be interesting. That they were aware of my blog and thought, well, you know, anything that's we kind of know how you write and a bit about you, and anything that's an extension of that, I think there's potentially a place. Go for it. So yes, it was quite what's the word? Yeah, it was I don't know. It was quite speculative.
Yeah.
With the idea that, well, actually, if this works, I'm prepared to back it up, and I'd really like to do it, but I'm not expecting to go far with it. And yeah, maybe it was asking the right question at the right time, or, you know, maybe I doubt myself. Maybe there really was a really good market for it.
Absolutely. And you mentioned this this pair, Alberto Cairo, Tamara Munzner, and this is the A.K. Peters series. And
Yes.
it's you know, there's been a batch of books, and we'll share the links to the different books in this series in the blog post for the episode. Now, obviously, you've mentioned there that in a sense you did go to them because I guess there was this appetite. But can you just expand a bit on the why would you write a book? I mean, you know, as something I've done myself, I know that it's a draining process. It's not something that's quick and simple and free of effort and time and commitment, which when it's perhaps alongside a day job, if not part of, it's a huge commitment. But you talked in a really lovely blog post that you wrote about some of the kind of rationale behind doing the book, and you mentioned your late uncle. Could you just sort of elaborate a bit on that sort of that context and the sort of motivation for just committing to this huge piece of work?
Well, yeah. I think in my case, we talk about labels, and in my case, I'm a mathematician, or I did a maths degree. So I was the only, you know, we're the only cohort of people who go through without having to do essays, without having to prove yourselves creatively or writing in any kind of way. So anything that I've done since in data visualization, I felt it's being creative for the first time. So that's why I'm quite sort of excited about this whole journey I've been on. It's been like a new start. And similarly, I've found that I enjoy writing. I enjoyed the blog posts about it. I mean, you know, some of them would take me a long time to write, and some of them I would just, you know, write quickly. But I did it. A lot of these things are new challenges to me. And you mentioned the blog post about my uncle, and he was. There's obviously perhaps more similarities with him than I realized, because he was a retired mathematician and professor as well, and yet he loved to write. He loved to. He had a whole library of books that he'd written that I wasn't really aware of until later in his life, and he got a lot of pleasure from just from the writing process and from the number of people that he could reach and help make his particular topic more accessible. So all these things sort of came together. Really, I didn't particularly see it as a big project. A lot of these things I just didn't know, because I don't consider myself an author. I consider myself a data visualization guy who's got a chance to write a book.
Yeah,
I went in not knowing if it would be easy, not knowing if it would be hard, not knowing if it would feel large or small or anything like that. I just thought, right, let's do this. And it, you know, in many ways, I think if I was to ever to do a second one, and that's a big if, I would know so much more about the process now. But you know, just going in with your eyes open, but without the experience of writing a book, and in many ways not sort of, you know, not asking too many questions or listening to other people who've done a book, because it was only ever going to be what I was going to write.
Yeah, of course.
It was just something I was happy to crack on and do, and it felt like, no pun intended, but it felt like a sort of new chapter of what I was doing. You know, it was a new project, so it gave me something, a whole new focus, rather than, okay, am I going to do something a little bit more similar to previous ideas? So perhaps, you know, previous years, and perhaps come up with some more creative visualizations and more blog posts. But this felt like something really different to focus me on, and you know, and whatever, you know, limited creative energy I had a new direction for it.
Absolutely, and it's not by any means a case that you've done a book that just started from a completely blank canvas. You know, when we get into the discussion about the content, you know, a lot of this is materializing and restructuring and repackaging and embellishing the blog posts that you've been pulling together on the website through the questions in Dataviz, which I guess already gives you a leg up into the project, so it doesn't feel like this huge, overwhelming, empty void that you've got to fill. But I mean, another thing that you talked about in that post as well is the idea of, you know, a legacy, you know, a thing that you've made, a thing that you can hold up and say, I did that, which is not always tangible when you do write a blog post, because although it's there in writing, it's digital, it's not manifestly physical, and you can't pick it up and flick through the page and smell it.
Yes.
It's always nice to say, right, I did this. And, you know, going back to the context of the AK Peters series, you know, there are many of the books out there, and we'll come on to, you know, some notion of where it sort of fits into the market of books, but there's just so much room. We don't need to not write a book because someone's maybe touched on that topic already. There's so much room for us all to contribute these things, and, you know, let's let editors decide if they don't want our book. Let's let readers decide if they don't want to buy the book. But you or one also, I guess, has this sense that maybe this opportunity won't come again. And certainly when I wrote my first book, that was very much a kind of a grabbing of an opportunity that I thought, if I don't say yes, maybe this ship will not come around again. So, you know, you've already articulated this, but there's lots of different ideas and factors that coalesce around yes, I'll do this project, that do motivate these things. But again, just going back to the context of you and your working schedule and your, you know, just life commitments outside of work. Just talk a bit about the context of, you know, the time commitment that this caused, and maybe the deadlines or the timescales that you'd discuss. I mean, you talked about it being a starting point in one of the lockdowns, but I guess lockdowns come to an end at some point, and then suddenly the busyness of life returns. But, you know, how did it fit into your life really as a project?
Well, it's funny in a way, because I felt like I pitched. I said, right, I'd like to write a book, and I got the go ahead. And they said, when do you want to, you know, when will you have it finished? And I sort of, finger in the air, thought, okay, New Year's Eve. And they said, okay, right, so we want this many pages, and this is the date. And it was, there was almost no restrictions, and that was something very, very new to me. I could write what I want. I could write, you know, I had a rough idea of how many words they wanted, and it seems like quite a big book, perhaps because I put lots of pictures in as well. But I didn't have any sort of preconceived idea as to whether this was longer or shorter than what I wanted to do. I just had, you know, I had 9 months or whatever it was, maybe about 6 or 7 months to write that many words. And so, I mean, I split it down into chapters, and it was easy to split into chapters because each chapter was pretty much exactly the same as a blog post. Yeah. Now I did some chopping and changing. I expanded some. I put 2 or 3 into one, and 1 or 2 of them were kind of new. But I knew roughly what the structure could be. And so in the end, I just sort of went ahead and did it. And I know life gets in the way, but I very much, you know, with data visualization being my hobby, it tends to be in the past, if I have a quiet Sunday or something I fancy doing, or something I just want to do, sort of sit in front of the football or the TV, I might sort of have a play and do data visualization. So these were the times where I could put, you know, an hour or 2 into writing one of the chapters.
Yeah.
I mean, there were ups and downs. I think I sort of had a fast start, and then had sort of 2 months where I didn't do anything, and then thought, crikey, Christmas, let's get it finished. But I think that's human nature rather than anything else.
Yes, I think it is.
And I think, you know, there was no commitments. I don't think they would have pulled anything had I not got to the deadline, and they'd have probably said, right, well, when can you do it? I just felt that, you know, there was no pressure. It was something that I wanted to do, so I was basically left alone to do it. And in a way, I surprised myself in doing exactly what I set out to do, and delivering it on the deadline that I said I would do it. Because that doesn't often happen with things in life.
Good. Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I think, you know, knowing that I had the preconceived structure and much of it, not not pre-written, but had at least the seeds of much of it written. That really helped bring me onto time, and make sure that I had a sort of rough idea of schedule and what I was going to do.
Now, we've not yet talked about the book. I mean, could you just speak to the sort of the basic premise of the book and, the proposition? What's somebody reading the book going to kind of get from it, really?
Well, I mean, they say write about what you know, and so the book is very much based on my own experiences and some of the thoughts and ideas that I've had, and so it's aimed for people a bit like me. So people have done a bit of data visualization, who've got a really good grounding, perhaps of the basics of what they should do, and perhaps they use a BI tool at work and can do some nice stuff. But people who perhaps are involved in the community or online or study or buy loads of books and think, I wonder if I could do stuff a bit like Georgia, or a bit like Sonia, or a bit like Nicolas Rouget, or a bit. The more people I mention, the more people I'm leaving out.
That's right.
If you study this and you take inspiration from others and think, well, I'm just a guy at work using this particular piece of software. Could I do that? What were they thinking when they did that? Is there a bridge for me to be able to do it?
But you are talking there, sorry to interrupt you, but you are talking there about people who would be characteristically seen as quite experimental, quite creative, quite pushing the boundaries of how you represent data, beyond the classic charts that we would use in business. So I get that,
That's
that
right.
you'd want to maybe appeal to people who want to go to the next level of creativity.
That's right, and it's for every person who appreciates that kind of way of thinking, there are probably several more that don't, and that that really will pride themselves on best principles and delivering great sort of business dashboards.
Yeah.
But that was never my speciality, or it's certainly not my intention with the book. And with the journey I took myself on, and people can't see me doing air quotes if they're listening on the podcast. You have to do that with the journey, don't you? But I mean, in terms of write about what you know, that's it. It helped me really sort of document all the different thought processes I had, thinking, well, they say you shouldn't do that, but what if I do? Or thinking, well, some of these people who I want to emulate, they do that, or some of these ideas, or perhaps images that I want to take inspiration from. That breaks a few rules, but wouldn't it be quite cool to do that? Wouldn't it be good? I'd love to be able to do something a bit like I see in some of the coffee table data visualization books that got me into the field in the first place.
Yeah.
What do I need to do in order to sort of break out of the mold of this should be a bar chart, and take that thought and some of those practical applications to the next level. And so that's what I'd always done on the sort of blog posts I wrote. The idea of making each one a question, I don't really know how that came about, but I think I realized it kind of worked quite nicely, and then I stuck to it, and I'm really glad that I did, because it always gave me a different angle in order to which to present a new idea that I had, and why did I do this, or what what decisions might you have had to have made in order to come to this decision and do something a little less conventional.
Well, that's it, and I think that, there's a few things there. I center everything in data viz around questions, frankly. I feel that although we talk a lot about data as being the fuel of data viz, the words there, the clues there, but before data comes questions. I wonder what, I wonder how many, I wonder if I can collect this or that. And so I love that framing of the content, not just on the blog post that you did before now, but obviously crystallizing the book. But I think it also, again, going back to that idea of it being about almost questions that you've had on your journey. And when you speak about the potential audience, it is the questions that people do have about, can I break this rule? When should I use this and that? And I think it also, whether it's by coincidence or, it is reflecting the zeitgeist, not getting too grand in terminology here, but this period, 2015 onwards, let's say, I think has been characterized by greater experimentation, greater creativity, an injection of new ideas and talent that has just pushed back a little bit against some of the dogmatic rules that did exist in popular discourse before that. And I think what we've all kind of now realized is that there's a time and place for everything, but it's just about knowing when to bend the rules that you mentioned there. And I think it's something that you have to go through the agony of trying to find the rights and wrongs in data viz. And what I love about the book is that you do help people on a very practical, plain English level, just rationalize, that mental flow chart that you face with all these different unique, large and small decisions. And you're absolutely right to talk about the idea that you're right about what you know, and you're right about almost things that you would enjoy or benefit from as an audience. But to what extent did you, or maybe Alberto, Tamara, inject some sense of, here's the book marketplace right now, here's what's not being written about, here's what's been written about loads of times? Did you have to do any sort of environmental scanning to still just carve out what this book had to be and not to be, perhaps, as much as anything?
Not really, but I would say not really, because I had that encouragement right from the start. I had the encouragement from the start from Alberto and Tamara and the team to say, well, if you write in the style of your blog, which we know it is sort of friendly, it's conversational. I haven't written any research papers. I don't have that background. For example, my sort of early chapter on color, there's no sort of research in it. There's nothing in the sort of sciences of color. It's just sort of what I've learned, what you've probably found. But have you thought of this? And I tell a story which I'm sure will appeal to you, of trying to give something red to an Everton fan, and as a Liverpool fan, you'll understand. No, these colours have far more significance than you might realize.
Yeah.
And there's I can't sort of write in a sort of, well, perhaps I can, but I don't have the validation or the background to sort of write in a formal scientific way. It's just perhaps these are some of the things that I found in my journey. And again, I call it questions in data viz. There aren't many answers in there. And you probably joke that the answer to probably almost all of them is it depends. And there's a sort of an example I think of. I gave a talk around that particular chapter, and talking about my book, all about the different things that you might need to think about in color that maybe you haven't come across.
Yeah.
And I spoke about, you don't necessarily have to use pink and blue for male and female. Look at all these other alternatives, and you might not have initially thought this, but is it a little bit cliche? I don't know. And someone came up to me, a lady who said, well, we use blue and pink, and I actually quite like being pink. I don't have a problem with that. Does that mean I have to change it? And I said, no, not at all. It's entirely up to you. I don't really have the answers. There's just a whole lot of things that I wouldn't necessarily have thought about, on day one of my data visualization journey.
Yeah.
Here's a whole load more things to think about, and then come up with whatever you're happy with. And or you probably have your own set of examples which are different to mine, which just add to the whole sort of experience around it.
And I think with that, I think it's, again, if we think about the potential readership, it may be beginners, but it may not be beginners. It may be people who've dabbled, who've sort of played around and who perhaps realize or believe that they think that there aren't rights and wrongs, and they want to make sure that that's actually the case. And I think that idea of not giving answers because there isn't an answer, there's just a load of trade-offs and compromises and human fingertip judgments to make, which for some people is deeply unsatisfactory. They want the comfort zone of just tell me what's right and what's wrong, and then that'll be my world. And again, I think that for the maturity of one's development in data viz, there's a point at which you need to embrace complexity, not complicatedness, but complexity. That things are messy, things are influenced by very small decisions, and if you take this decision, it'll lead to this and that. But there isn't a single pathway for these things, and so I like the almost enigmatic sense that you don't just give an answer, but you just say, here's just a bundle of things to weigh up, many of which are not theoretical, empirical learnings, but more just human, everyday, practical, pragmatic things that you've experienced, but that you've also gone through, I guess, in working life as well. Because I'm sure this is not just, this sort of second track of your career that's distinct from your working life. It's formulated from that.
No, that's right. And a lot of it as well is also just about, well, how did you even come up with that idea? So sometimes, I'll point to influences, and I'll point to how that influence maybe sort of sparked an idea in my head, and maybe I'll point to some of the questions that I had to go through. And I sort of, in that sense, I like to keep it simple and sort of showcase what you can get to if you're happy to think of things that you might not have thought before. And that doesn't necessarily mean sort of bending and breaking rules. Sometimes it does, but yeah, I think I've sort of structured it in the way that maybe some of the first part of the book is looking at some of these basics of principles, but as I got towards the end of the book, I had things which were more just sort of showcasing ideas, really.
Yeah.
And thinking, once I'd been through this kind of the journey, this was the mindset I had. I came up with this idea. You might be interested in it. It might lead you to think, well, I like what you've done, but I might have done it a bit differently and improved it and all this kind of thing. So I feel like it's not sort of all challenging everything and things like that, but I think it's sort of introducing that mindset that the bar is. Would you say the bar is high or the bar is low? I'm not sure, but the bar is that anything is on the table. I mean, I've sort of spoken about bending and breaking rules as part of this book, and I really think the only rule that I am never really prepared to break is having my bar charts at 0. I think that particularly is sacrosanct, but I'm happy to sort of be part of the conversation that maybe explains parts, examples when you don't. Anything else, I more or less think go for it. Just understand why it might not be suitable in a business context, or it might be suitable in this context or this context. But
yeah,
want to have fun, if you want to do something creative, if you want to be deliberately mischievous and break rules to the extent that it upsets people, and I don't mean it upsets people or offends them with the content, but it's some people think, oh, you've gone too far there, but then that's okay. But understand, what your motives for doing it are.
Yeah, of course.
To learn, to be more creative, to have fun, to do something that you think might look quite cool on a poster, even if no one else might think that. And then I think it just sort of, it just leads to a sort of nice wide portfolio of ideas. And one thing I always sort of mention is that a lot of the skills you get, a lot of the technical skills you get, can actually be really useful then for your day-to-day job. So I think sometimes it can go sort of really full circle. I've had situations where I've had this sort of light bulb moment as to how I can maybe do some radial calculation or something like that, and I think, oh, that's actually exactly what I needed to do in that dashboard I was stuck at work.
Yeah.
So sometimes it takes you out of your technical comfort zone as well, not just your creative and your question and things like that. So I think that's all. It's very much. I feel like I've gone a little bit off topic here because I can't remember what the question was, but I do feel it very much sort of intertwines with your sort of professional and creative development as well.
Well, that's exactly it. And it's not just the thinking; it's the doing. It's the thoughts behind and planning and preparation, but then also the execution. So it does all dovetail. And if you do something once and never use it again, well, you just never use it again. That's absolutely fine. But you talked right there about this notion of, in a sense, there's a journey, a kind of notional sort of 3-section journey where you do kind of go from, fairly, here are the kind of fundamentals of all this, and then into something that's a little bit more of a departure to, now here, let's just sort of push these boundaries a little bit. And then, as you said, sort of you kind of finish off with a little bit, and let's go for it now.
Yes.
Now, from a structure and a writing process point of view, given that you had all these blog posts, as material to draw from and to build from, I'm sure there's a sort of chicken and egg question here, but how did you go about writing the book from the point of view of, right, I've got all these contents there, I've got perhaps this overall structure in my mind here, and how do I bring those two together? And a spin-off question too there, to what extent did you then have to almost recommission yourself to perhaps plug some gaps that you realized on reflection the blog posts didn't cover?
Yeah, it was, again, because of the pre-existence of the blog post, it was perhaps simpler than it had a right to be. I basically sort of went through each and decided which I thought were useful and had good content that I could expand on and which didn't. And then it was almost a case of, right, that goes in the first section, that goes in the second section, that goes in the third, and sort of, I don't think I physically did it, but it's sort of almost having these on cards and sort of shuffling them and thinking, I think that works, and let's order them in this direction. There were a few gaps. There was, I wanted to write a little bit more of my own content, I think, particularly in the middle, I think, to kind of draw it on. And I think there was probably more pruning in the final section, because the final section was all sorts of a sort of mishmash of things that
wild,
I could
include.
Yeah, exactly. So I sort of trimmed that down a little bit. But I think that, I suppose the thing with my blog posts is that the very nature of them is that they're bite-sized. You read them start to finish, but you don't read them in conjunction with anything else. You read them if you find them or when they're released. Yeah, something standalone. So it was really, I suppose it was just sort of trying to find a narrative, putting them in sections like that sort of allowed me to make a narrative. So they're very much not chronological.
Yeah.
I mean, they are a bit, probably most of the first section came from earlier blog posts, but it's not the same chronology as the blog, but it did, having these sort of bite-sized elements of things to talk to did really help with that.
So sorry, I was going to say, it feels like it's almost like an anthology of like a collection of essays, of writings, and I guess that helps people to just be able to dip into one section without having to have read all the previous sections for that to make sense.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a kind of book that you can just sort of look into for inspiration, or just sort of for as you say, a chapter at a time. And you don't necessarily have to have read the chapters before it, or go on to the chapters after it. I mean, you might find that perhaps for more experienced readers, they might not feel they need to look too deeply into the first section.
Yeah,
stuff that's sort of quite familiar to them. But yeah, I'm certainly pleased with the way it was able to flow through that, and that's sort of some of the nice feedback that I've had, is that they like the way that I structured it in that way, and that to me, because a lot of the content is semi pre-written, that to me was the major sort of editorial decision I made writing the book, and so that's been really nice validation in that sense.
Now, just from a very practical point of view, how did you write the book? So was it Microsoft Word? Did you use any other applications? You said mostly cards, but did you use any sort of sticky notes and flip charts to organize and plan?
Not really. No, it was pretty low tech. It was just a chapter at a time in Microsoft Word, and copy and paste the images in, and there you go. Yeah, I wish I could say it was higher tech. It really wasn't. In a way, that made it more. It made it easy to do, and that's fine. Just write it, but it meant I still have no idea what it's going to look like.
Yes,
how big, what it's going to look like in sort of post production, because I thought, and it kind of made me nervous, because I thought, well, cracky, I don't want it to end up like a whole load of Times New Roman sort of word pasted things like that. But that's what I've given them.
Yeah.
But no, you don't, or I wasn't required to do sort of anything more high tech than that. And no, I'd love to say I had sort of sticky notes and more sort of creative ideas, but I think perhaps beyond the first day or week or two when I was deciding the structure, that became something of that was consigned to the past.
Now, you mentioned there kind of editorial perspectives, and I'm wondering, you kind of alluded to the fact that because most of this already existed, it was perhaps in some respects a bit more pruning than writing from scratch in most cases, albeit I'm sure there were, as you've said, a few chapters that had to be kind of just sort of undertaken. But how did you find the editing process? Because again, from personal experience, writing version 1 or draft 1 wasn't the worst task in the world, but turning draft 1 into a refined, well-written, concise version 2 was painful. And with that involves removing things and killing things, and you get quite precious about these things. So how did you find that sort of experience?
Yeah, it's sort of frustrating in a way. It's again because I was new to the whole process, I just felt privileged to have the opportunity to do it. I would probably, agree to more things than I would if I was if I was a writer with more clout and experience. I didn't have to do it too much at all, to be honest. I think the vast majority of what I wanted to put in stayed in. It was more just a case of yeah, again, because I've said, because so many of these chapters were sort of standalone, it became difficult and time consuming to consider it as a whole.
Yeah.
And is everything still in the right place? But in the end, I was, I didn't have too much in the way of revisions to do. It seemed to take forever, but maybe that's just sort of natural human patience. The editing and the publishing process actually took longer than the book writing process in the first place. Sort of 11 months versus about 7 months, and there's times I'm thinking, well, what are they doing? What do I do next? I've spent the last 6-7 months writing. Now what do I do? But no, it was smoother than I feared it would be, and a lot of the times, there are ways that you write which you and I might know this, but come across as particularly English as opposed to which I didn't know. So I write things like firstly, secondly, thirdly, and I get big lines through that. No, you mean first, second, third. What? Okay, no, I don't mind. Just don't put a Z in data visualization, and I'll agree with most of the rest of the thing.
And it's interesting that I think the tone of voice is always a difficult thing to find as well with a certainly a first book, until you get that sense of input from an editor. And I don't know, I think there can be something quite dry about reading books that are just very, kind of academic prose. And although I acknowledge and appreciate the clarity and the conciseness of that tone of voice, when we're talking about things that are creative and human, I think it's nice to just inject a bit of personality. And obviously that will come across by default from the source material of your blog post, because it's you writing a blog post. At that point, it's not having to write it for a book. And the other thing I was thinking about in terms of the kind of, obviously the content, and something that's still for me sort of a traumatic memory is imagery and permissions to get works included as figures. Can you just speak to that and what you went through there? Because it's sometimes underappreciated amount of work goes into that, and also the attention that sometimes exists when you haven't quite secured permission for something, but you've written about it. So do you have to then change the writing to change the example? But how did that go for you?
There were elements of that. It was mostly okay, and the reason it was mostly okay is because people who I've always found in their journey through data visualization, people who I've emulated and wanted to be like them, and so there's the same people that I wanted to include in the book. They've been so supportive all the way, and these same people, some of the people I've already mentioned, were happy to say, yes, of course you can have my visualization in there. I'd be honored. And that was, I think, whenever there was an individual person involved, it was always the case that they were happy to include. I think bar none. There were probably 4, 5, 6 publications that or images that I wanted to put in that belong to publications, and that's when I realized, oh crikey, this is going to cost money.
That is the distinction. Yeah, people are easily up for it, but
Yeah,
publications, yeah.
and there's a lot of hoops you have to go through to pay for it as well. And it got to the stage where I thought, well, all right, maybe I don't need that one. Maybe I don't need that one. And there ended up being just 2 where I thought, my whole chapter's around that. I'm gonna have to suck it up and pay for that. And it's it's absolutely fine. That's what you do. Like, one example being the triangles example. I thought it was so important to have the New York Times, was it them? The example of the triangle shapes for the drying out reservoirs. I felt it sort of started the whole conversation going, and I just thought, I gotta go for it. I need to pay for this. I'm not expecting to make a huge amount of money for this book, and it could be that the whole thing actually runs at a loss just on the basis of having to pay for a couple of images, but that's okay. But yeah, usually when it's been individual people who've done it, they've been really, really supportive.
Absolutely.
Even someone like, I'll just sort of call out one example. I wanted to use Nigel Holmes's famous example, the one that Edward Tufte hates as chart junk, and I felt it was a really important part of the discussion to include. And I thought, well, I don't know Nigel. He said very respected. I hope he says yes. And he was delighted. He gave me a high quality image. We had a chat. I realized he was also doing a book in the same series, and not only was it a straight yes, but it was a new connection to one of the great people that I admire in data visualization. So that's typical of what would happen 99% of the time, and it's only when you're dealing with a newspaper publication or something like that where they just have rules, and
that's it.
There's a couple of straight no's. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, and they're the difficult ones, definitely. And as you said, you got to just weigh up: do I pay for it? Do I just have to move on and find something else? Can I recreate something myself, perhaps, and use my own work?
Yeah.
But the other visual aspect of this is the cover, designed by Ali Tauben. It's a brilliant cover. How did that come about? How did you end up commissioning Ali for that? And were there any bits of guidance that you gave, or did you just sort of pick up the brief from the title and go with it?
Well, no, it's to answer your question, yes, there was a bit of guidance that I gave, and a very small bit. Again, I contacted Ali. It never occurred to me to contact anyone else. I knew that she would be a brilliant data visualization cover designer. I said, and when we first got in touch, he said, "Oh, is that because I'm doing the image for Jen Christensen's book as well?" And I thought, I don't think so. Had I subconsciously seen that or what? I don't know. But I already knew, because of the sort of crossover work that she does between design and data visualization, that she was a great person to talk to. And I commissioned Ali, and I said, well, I want it to look like something that I would have thought of or kind of done. And I was really vague, and I thought, I'm being a nightmare client here, am I not? But she went away and looked at my stuff and came up with color palettes and mood boards and Pinterest things, and my eyes were open. I thought, wow, I've given you almost nothing, and you've shown me some amazing stuff here, and we got some ideas. And a couple of days later, said, well, this is my first thought. What do you think? And I said, stop. That's it. We're having it. That's wonderful. The image that we've seen, I think we maybe tweaked a color or two, and that was pretty much it. And in fact, because she mocked it up, and I think it's the same mock-up that you've used with this explain image, mocked it up as someone having the book and perhaps with a nice little cup of coffee and relaxing on a desk. When I knew that was the image, I was so excited at that point, because it came at the point when things had gone quiet. They were taking a long time editing. I didn't know when it was going to come out. The excitement from seeing the brand, if you like, of the book, the image associated with it, and the sort of the wonderful emerging question mark that Ali came up with. I was definitely a high point of the process.
And to your point before, you're probably still thinking of this Microsoft document, and now you can see this physical manifestation being mocked up in real life. Yeah,
exactly. That was a huge jump in reality or in visualizing the stage of it, and it just made me think, wow, it's happening.
Absolutely.
Professional designer has just come up with something amazing. It must be my book then.
Yeah.
So.
No, that's brilliant, and I think it's a super kind of ident for the book. It's something that's recognizable and kind of instantly, that's that book, that's that cover, and you can use that as hero images on websites, for slide decks. It's a really nice way to kind of capture the essence of the book, as well as give it some sort of literal kind of
I
logo.
love it. I've been blatant. I have it on T-shirts. I have it on my watch.
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
it's a logo that's a sort of brand behind the whole book, which I'm delighted with.
Get the merchandise going. Now I've got a few kind of almost kind of quick fire questions. Now this has been out for a couple of months now, so you've had that distance, not from just writing and seeing it kind of come to life and getting the first copy, which I'm sure was as exciting as that kind of mock-up, but sort of reflections in general. How do you reflect on what was the most difficult part of this process?
I think the difficult part, I think the hardest part to write was the preface and the introduction, because it was brand new writing for me, and I almost didn't know what to do. I thought, what do I include? And I wrote and rewrote that more times than I did anything else. And you've got this sort of idea that, oh, this might be the bit that people see for free on Amazon. This might be the bit that's going to drive people to or from your book. And I felt more responsibility for those than I did any of the content. The content, I knew what it was going to be, and I thought there's going to be plenty of people who don't like it, but they're not they're not the people I'm targeting the book at. People who know me will know roughly what it's going to be like. But I did find the introduction and the preface much more difficult, because that feels like almost a different skill. That's a skill of drawing people in and summarizing what you want to put and why you want people to buy the book and read it, I guess. Yeah.
I remember the first draft of my preface, which is quite developed, was one of the worst piece of writings by a human ever. And I've kept it as a reminder of what I'm capable of in terms of wretched writing. So yeah, I do sympathize with that task. How do you reflect on the kind of efficiency of how you pull the book together? You talked about kind of 9-month time frame. Obviously, you nailed the deadline. But do you look back and now think, actually, I hit all the right notes, right times, right rhythms, took advantage of the time? Or do you say, I wish I'd had another 3 months, or wish I'd been more efficient in that thing?
I don't think so. I think having a deadline was really helpful, because if I'd had longer, would I have put in more chapters that I didn't need? Would it have added sort of more stress? It meant right away, I thought, right, these are the chapters I'm going to write. This is going to be the approximate number of word count. I was given an advisory number of words, and I can't remember what it was, but I figured out how much that would be in chapters. And I think just having that made it efficient and maybe do it. I don't think it would have been possible to write a book that was half the length, but I don't regret that it isn't half the length. This was the amount of content that I had, the amount of stuff that I wanted to write, and I had the time to do it. And I'm lucky in as much as it's an additional project for me. It's not to fund my retirement on a Caribbean island. It's not to move away from my day job and become an author or anything like that. So it's just something that 2, 3, 4 years ago I might not have imagined would happen. And as you say, now it's a physical copy of a book in my hand to be proud of, regardless of how successful it is.
Absolutely. I mean, another good question that was posed for me to ask you was about, when do you stop? When's the last edit? When's the last thing you add? And obviously a deadline informs that to some extent, but did you get to that point you felt finished?
Yeah, I think so.
Because you can edit forever, obviously.
Yeah, I can't remember the actual numbers, but because I had a sort of guideline number of words to hit and a sort of number of chapters I was sort of aiming at, I kind of always knew the rough amount that should be in it. And there was an element of, I might have 16 different chapters that I want to put in this last section, which I've decided should have 10 or 11 chapters. Which ones do I stop? Which ones do I cut? But I wasn't, I didn't mind doing that too much. And as I say, because I was relieved to stop in the end, because because I was writing a bit more quickly and the Christmas coming up to it. I was happy to get to the end, and at no point did I think, oh, I wish I'd put that in. And because I knew there would always be a little bit more than could potentially go in. There was an element of relief, and click and send, and it's done. So
now on to what was the best bit, either of the writing process or even an element in the book, which is your favorite chapter, for example, or the favorite bit of content?
I don't know. Well, I almost want to say that my favorite bit is the front cover. I do still think that is true.
Well, that's fine.
I think one of my favorite chapters is a chapter about triangles, because it just made me go and explore and find out how many triangle visualizations are out there and things that are shaped. And I thought, no one's written this before. It's daft almost. Why would you have a chapter about triangles? But I feel like it is a good kind of summary of the middle section of the book. So when I sort of give talks with sort of teasers of what's in the books, that's always a chapter that I sort of focus on and talk around. And as I say, I don't have answers, but I think people will come away from it thinking, I never even thought about triangles, and now I've just seen sort of 10 completely different examples, which might inspire me to do something like that. Or it might tell me there's a good reason why I've never done anything with that's absolutely fine. I think that's one of my favorite chapters.
Now, obviously, you've said this is the first book you've written, and you've obviously gone through this with a degree of this is all a kind of positive experience. That's what comes across. It's it's fun, it's enjoyable. I'm really appreciative of the opportunity. But is there anything that you could have been told before you started this, on reflection, that would have helped? One pearl of wisdom that, if I wish someone had sort of told me about this or warned me about this?
I honestly don't think so. I mean, maybe just have had a little bit more knowledge and understanding about the sort of the timings. Because human nature means, once you've sort of handed it in, you don't really understand why is it sort of taking 11 months to get to the end. Because you're blind to the process and all the other things that particular company is doing. It's like being any client of anyone, isn't it? It's like, why haven't I got it straight away? I don't think it was necessarily a surprise to me, though, and I don't think if anyone had told me that, it would have put me off or made me time things any differently. I actually really enjoyed going through the whole process blind. I didn't have expectations. Maybe things like, people have said, oh, well, you could have negotiated your contract, you could have asked for this, you could have asked for that. Could I asked to write a book. They said yes. I wasn't gonna.
You can get a Ferrari.
A dinky one, maybe a toy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. It was never about that for me. So really, I felt I was in the right place with the right team, given the opportunity to write the book, pretty much under my terms. Even the terms of the pricing and sales and things like that are not under my terms at all. Well, that's fine. That's what I've written it for. I got what I wanted to write in the timescale that I wanted to write it.
Absolutely. And then 2 remaining questions. Is there a second book in there? And I'm kind of pointing to your head. Do you feel that you've got another book in the future? Maybe it'll take a time to get there, but is this the end of the journey for Neil Richards as author, or do you think there's a?
I don't know. It hasn't put me off. I sort of tease people when I sort of release it or put posts out saying, oh, my first book is out. First?
Yeah.
What do you mean? And I think if there was to be a sequel, it would have to be more questions in DataViz, and you could do the same thing more or less in the same. It couldn't be answers in DataViz, because I don't, those linguistically, they're the 2 ways that a sequel could go. I don't know. I enjoyed it, and I'm enjoying the process now, and I'm enjoying, it gets me the chance to talk to you guys and talk to other people. But I think I had the leg up for my first one because it used a lot of content that I'd already written in parts. I think writing something else in scratch now would be quite an undertaking, which I haven't ruled out.
Yeah,
but I certainly
you
haven't
can always be
started.
alert to it, I guess. Yeah, and then closing on a positive thing. So, what's been the favourite piece of feedback or the favourite comment that you received, or just a moment you thought, I'm really content with how that's landed or been received by somebody?
I've had some lovely feedback, and often it's things like I really enjoyed the book. It feels like we were down the pub talking, or it feels like you were talking to me.
Right.
The people, these are people that I perhaps know anyway, but it just felt like having a really good conversation.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I was trying to put out. So that's been my favorite feedback, really. Just that the book feels like like a chat, a conversation. That I was going to say an argument, but I don't mean a sort of contradictory
Yes.
argument.
Yeah.
Conversations you might get into down the shop or the pub, and that I was really pleased with that.
Yeah, I think that is a nice response, because, as you said, that is the tone that the original posts took, and the premise that you talked about being the intention behind the book. So I think if that's what people are getting from it, then you can't ask for much more. So fantastic, brilliant book, Neil. Really love that it exists. Congratulations on getting through it, and all the success in the future with it. And let's see if there's another second book, sequel, whatever that may be, in due course. Yeah. But thank you for your time, Neil. It's been great to learn about the process behind that book. And thank you to listeners and viewers for joining us for this first episode of season 4. And we'll see you again soon. Take care for now. See you soon.
Thanks, Andy. Bye-bye.
To see more information about today's episode, including some links to key sites and resources mentioned, please visit my website at visualizingdata.com. Here you'll also be able to find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing and spreading the word. See you next time.